Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to join all of you who are participating in the Texas Association of Museums meeting, and I am delighted to be one of your speakers today. And as the description says, today I'm going to be talking about Jedi work. That's anybody that knows me knows that I may work with the past, but I play with the future and science fiction. But Jedi work is something we all should be doing. And by Jedi, I mean justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion work in our museum field. And what does it look like? So we're going to talk about some of the strategies today that you may employ at your institution. We're also going to talk about some of the outcomes of what effective Jedi work actually looks like, not just within the organization, but how it impacts your organization moving outward. And we're going to also talk about missteps, because frankly, some of these more successful strategies came about by making some really bad mistakes. And I will say that more often than not, that's the space that we find ourselves in museums, despite our best efforts. And I'm going to talk you through how all of this can work, and where you're going to have to find that specific space in your community. All right, I'm not sure exactly what happened, but I trust that you all can see and hear me now. As I was saying, the conversation that we were having in our own institution about whether or not our organization, the Jamestown Yorktown Foundation, should put out a statement of solidarity. And as such, my response was no. And to get into more detail about why that would be no, and especially, frankly, it was a bit of a surprise to them that I would give that as my response, because I was and am the first woman and person of color to lead this organization. So it was deemed rather odd that I would not want to do it. And I said, I don't want to do it because I believe that as an institution, we have work to do on the inside first, before we make public statements. And just as soon as I said that, I watched colleagues around the country get burned through social media as other letters and comments started flowing in to them about, well, talk to us about this, what your staff looks like. Well, why haven't you been involved in our programs before? Well, why haven't you, when we asked you, if we could use space for a meeting, and so forth and so on. There was a lot of pushback on organizations that did this. And again, I applaud the desire, the underlying desire, but unless Jedi work is consistent, if it is something that you are constantly evaluating and an organizational goal, and it becomes a part of basically everything you do, you will trip and fall, and you will find yourself in the middle of these landmines when really what you were hoping for was to let the community know that you were embracing them. And so again, what could that possibly look like? Clearly, that was a misstep for some organizations. But what does it look like when we are successful? And like I said at the top, it has to be through every layer of the organization, a commitment. Now, whether that takes the form of strategic planning on your organization's part, whether that means putting out a specific statement about diversity and inclusion work in your institution, or whether it just becomes a mandate that is built into the fiber of your organization through its leadership. And by leadership, I mean not only the person who sits in the executive director or CEO role, but it also has to come through the board. And the board has to engage in this work themselves to help diversify their own boards. But what does diversity look like? And I tell people a lot, sometimes when we think of diversity, we are thinking about the main demographics. We're talking about gender, we're talking about ethnicity, we're talking about, in some cases, religious diversity, and all of those things, which are lovely. But the reality is also that sometimes when we go looking for board members in particular, we aren't often getting the voices to the table that are going to really help us understand our operations and really help us expand that circle or that sphere of influence within the organization. And so instead, what we end up with is shading. You're shading the room, but you're not really diversifying the room. And you're certainly not creating space that enables a more inclusive environment. And what does inclusivity look like? It means, number one, being respectful of all of the folks that are in that space and the differing opinions that they bring. It means having a standard where conversations can be had, where there's even discord, where there's even difference of opinion, but together you are able to come together for the better of the institution based on that mission to provide a workable solution. It isn't about setting up camps. It isn't about breaking down. It isn't about gaining power or control. It is about what is best for the community that we are serving and the institution that we are here to advocate for, to govern over as well, right? And so, and this is often where the first set of conflicts come into play. It's because the boards may not be as diversified. The boards may decide that they're going to put that as a requirement on the executive director without the resources to do so, without a conversation about its own equity, equity, diversity, and inclusive operations. And so things start to break down, and there's a pressure on the executive director to be the end all be all. Now, certainly the executive director can guide this work, both for the board as well as for the staff, but to expect that it's just something that, you know, the board gives to the executive director and walks away is going to inevitably lead to some conflict. And in some cases will more than likely lead to not achieving the goals that you've set out for yourself. And then there's also, when we talk about this, there's also the staff. Are they prepared? What does it look like to them? You know, are you running up against the idea that, and I have heard this in my 30 plus years in this work, well, we just don't even know where to begin to find qualified candidates for the job. Now, how many of you have heard that in your spaces? There just aren't enough qualified people for the job. And what I've come to understand over the years, particularly in the last 5 years, is that we are often not looking in the right places, and we are not feeding or developing pipelines that would make our institutions places that people want to go. Yes, you want a certain level of expertise. Yes, you want a certain level of skill sets, but I can promise you that many of you may not have looked very carefully at what the job descriptions actually say, and the language and the words that are being used, and whether or not, intentionally or not, whether or not those job descriptions are essentially gatekeeping. What does the outside world, the potential applicant who is coming to you, when they read that job description, what have you put in there that has made it less attractive? And it could be little things like, you know, and some of you may have seen this. This was a really interesting situation that came up back in January. Actually, it happened in February, where the Newfield Museum, and I don't mind talking about specific institutions because they have taken this huge misstep and turned it around. But they were seeking a senior curator position, and they had hired a executive search firm to help them do that. And in this job description, they had all kinds of explanations and things about equity and diversity and help us do this. I mean, really putting the weight of the institution's diversity efforts on this curator position. And then in the final paragraph, after all of these things were said, but also bear in mind that we must keep and attract our core white audience. And the museum world and those outside of us exploded. And with it were all kinds of examples, other examples of how the institution had failed on all of these fronts, not just with this job description, but the way in its physical environment, being adjacent to Black and Brown communities, but building pathways and walkways to the north side of its site to attract biking and walking from the other side of the site, which, or I think it was the north side of the property, that faced the more affluent white community, walling off sections of it to its Black and Brown community, which literally just a few blocks to its south, right? And so the Newfield was caught up in this swirl. And the institution took that as a learning opportunity, didn't push back, but spent the time actually listening to what was being said from peers and community members alike. And together they drafted first an apology, identifying all of the ways that they had failed themselves as an organization and made clear of the challenges they were facing. And rather than saying, oh, well, we're going to go and hire a consultant to come in here and help us do, they said, look, we're going to be doing all of this work immediately with our community. And we're going to get facilitators where necessary. But basically, we owe our community better to do the work that we're doing. And some of you may be familiar with what I'm referring to. And I guess a month or so after that, they put out an extraordinarily compelling document that they made available and public to the world. And I read through that document, and all I could do was give them a standing ovation for that, because they identified in that document all the steps that they were going to take and where their check-ins were going to be, not what all the solutions were going to be, but what steps they were going to take to try to understand and to try to make their institutions better. And again, this was an extraordinary public maelstrom, is no other way to describe it. But they came back in an earnest way that I have been watching, following along to see how they're doing. And so far, so good. And yes, there have been more missteps, but there is a candor and an honesty that the institution has laid forth that I don't think had been experienced prior. So again, that's an example of how to take control of a situation. Now, but back to this idea of sometimes we're doing things that we're not even aware of. And I was talking about where we may unintentionally be placing language in our job descriptions that are gatekeeping versus welcoming or accessible, right? And I hope that one of the things that we've also learned through this pandemic and period where some of our institutions have been closed and we've gone to this virtual world, which is that it's helped us understand accessibility a little bit differently as well. When it comes to the individuals, whether they're individuals with physical disabilities of one sort or another, or other types of disablement where they are, or differentness, where they are able to now be a part of our institutions virtually. We saw an extraordinary example of that at the Smithsonian, at the National Air and Space Museum, where when they had to shut down and then reopen because the vast majority of our volunteer corps are individuals that are over 60, what they were able to do is they were able to set up very inexpensively monitors in certain sections of their galleries where their volunteers could be safely at home and talk about that section where they had the expertise in that section. And they trained the volunteers to let the walk-in visitor know that they were in fact a live person there to ask and answer questions with them. Simple things like, hi, I really love that color blue on you. That looks fantastic. Welcome to the Air and Space Museum. My name is so-and-so. And that taught us, that showed us, if we were paying attention, that we can engage those members of our community who very much are active and want to be engaged with our institutions, but may not be able to do so because of some limitation, right? But they can still be a part of us. We should have learned by now through this epidemic or pandemic that the same holds true when we think about staff employment. We know that virtual work can work. So what does that look like as we are thinking about jobs in our organizations and how we may move forward, and what other types of strategies we may employ? All of these things are critical if we are going to pivot, if we're really going to pivot into Jedi work. Next, I want to talk to you a little bit more about what is the outcome? What do we want to happen? I would hope that most of us would hope that our institutions are actually reflective of not only our immediate communities, which more often than not, our immediate communities tend to not be as diverse, but sometimes they are, right? Whatever. But whatever those demographics are, whatever those particular needs are of the immediate community and the regional communities that we are serving, we should be able to look carefully and listen intently to what the communities say they need. And justice is essentially, to me, justice and equity to me really means is a form of accessibility. It is recognizing when wrongs have been done and putting in the work to correct it. Another example of, and I'll talk specifically about some of the things that are going on here at the Jamestown Yorktown Foundation as well. But again, another colleague, our friends at Mount Vernon, last year found themselves in a situation where, for at least a good 10, 15 years, they've been doing a lot of work around the 300 plus enslaved persons that were at George and Martha Washington's Mount Vernon. A lot of research, archaeology, knowing names, stories, details, just extraordinary work, adding immeasurably to our scholastic understanding through that work. And yet, with all of that, they had not really looked across the board at the organization and some of the other things that were taking place. And they got called out by an academic who came to visit because she was so excited with some of the more recent findings that they had. And she went into the gift shop. And in the gift shop, she saw magnets being sold of George Washington's false teeth. Because, most Americans have been taught through national narrative that George Washington could never tell a lie and that his false teeth were wooden. Neither of those things are true. In fact, there's two surviving sets of George Washington's false teeth. One is at Mount Vernon and the other is at the American Dental Association Museum. Both sets of those false teeth are made from ivory and the teeth of enslaved people. And there are records in Washington's journals and records and letters to his dentist that small amounts of money were paid to these slaves as compensation for taking their teeth so that he could have this set of teeth. And yet, in this little thing, this little seemingly small act, the institution was selling, right? Selling as sort of a gag gift, refrigerator magnets of George Washington's teeth. Despite the fact that the website had this extraordinary information about the rumor of the false teeth, and they missed it because it wasn't, again, an organizational-wide effort to make sure that everything that we are doing in every space is making sure that every visitor understands this history well, has access to this history in an honest way. Okay? And so they took heat. I mean, another one of those examples of it took heat, it caught it, they got rid of it, they don't sell them anymore. When I came here to the Jamestown Yorktown Foundation, among the first people to come to see me was the indigenous staff. And they wanted to share with me why their work was so important to them. And these are descendants of Virginia Indians and other Algonquin-speaking peoples who have come to work for this organization over the years, and why the institution hadn't always been able to keep these staff members. And it was because of insensitivities coming from visitors who would say things, and insensitivities that staff would say, something, little microaggressions every now and then, even after people let other staff members know, hey, I really don't like it when you say that. Could you not say that to me? And it would continue. I don't know what the big deal is. They'd be gaslighted, right? So they came and they talked to me. And they also talked to me about how resources were allocated, and they felt not equitably across the three primary areas at our Jamestown settlement site. And when I looked at all of this, I realized they were absolutely right. Of the three primary sites, the recreated James Fort, what was then called the Powhatan Indian Village, and the three ships. The Powhatan Indian Village, as it was called, was the second most visited of all of our sites, and it was the least funded of all of our sites. And so as I continued to kind of work through and talk with them and others to try to get a better understanding, fortunately, the lead of the education unit came to me and said, we have an opportunity to do something that we should have done 15 years ago. Because 15 years ago, the organization received from the governor's office, within the governor's office, there was the Council of Virginia Indian Affairs. And they had put out a statement in advance of the 2007 400th commemoration of the arrival of the English and the permanent settlement here, to make clear the correct pronunciations and titles, their distaste with Powhatan Indian Village, when in fact we all knew that this recreated place was actually based on extensive archaeology on an exact location that we knew the name of. And I was flabbergasted to hear from the previous marketing director, Powhatan Indian Village is just easier to market than the real name. Really? Easier to market. Interesting. Well, guess what? We're going to change it. And so I had to do the work of getting with my board and making sure they all understood, provided them all of the historical referencing that I needed, and I got a vote before a meeting. Got a vote to change the name to Paspahegh-town, which is what the natives called it and what the English called it. In every single record, the English referred to it as Paspahegh. No more difficult to pronounce than Dostoevsky, for God's sake. But we have convinced ourselves that these things are not worth our time or effort to get it right. And it can be those little, again, microaggressions and outright decisions that can impact the way that your work can be viewed by the communities that you claim to serve. And so, again, this Jedi work involves all of these kinds of things. As we continue this process at the Jamestown Yorktown Foundation, we are looking across the board at everything. We are looking at master planning in a whole new way. And yes, I am absolutely looking at, does my staff reflect the communities that we want to serve and are serving? And are we providing opportunities for people to grow across the board, to grow in this field? Are we providing pipelines? Are we making ourselves the kind of place where a young Native person would want to work, where a young African-American person may want to work, where I may be able to attract first-generation Africans who are in our region to may want to come and work in the History Museum field? What could that look like? You know, what does that look like? What kind of training do we provide to our staff to improve their understanding of these issues? And also, what will it take for us to deconstruct every training program, every manual? What does that look like? What does that effort look like? The truth is, if we are sincere about this work, then we're willing to put in the work. It is all about consistent pressure, constantly applied, if you want to make a difference, if you want to have real impact, if you want to be intentional about your mission and your mission delivery. These are the kinds of things that we do. And I will stop just here for a moment, because I think one of the biggest missteps that are made is that somehow talking about this kind of work is about eliminating something else, when really it's all connected to what I have been saying a lot more lately. There are those out there who use the term, we have to change the narrative. Change is good. What we're really talking about here is correcting, narrative correction, where for decades, the stories of us as a nation have in fact, more often than not, been exclusionary, or at best tacked on people of color as an addendum to what we have regarded as the primary story. And that's something else that we all have to take a careful look at. It is reflected in our collections, and what we consider valuable and worthy of collection is predominantly white and predominantly male, without being able to provide the real environment in which these people operated that included all of these others. Again, an example, we are talking through this work at JYF. And, you know, our goal is to help our visitors understand, yes, Jamestown, first permanent English settlement, Virginia, got it. But here's the thing. Different European nations were exploring the North American continent a good 60, 70 years before Jamestown was settled. In fact, the English had tried desperately to get a colony established, all really an attempt to stop the Spanish spread that was coming up from the south. So you had the Dutch coming in from the North Atlantic and down the Great Lakes and along the Mississippi. You had the Spanish coming up from the south, from Central and South America, Mexico. You had the Dutch, you had the Swedes, you had the Germans. All of these folks are coming in. And this is part of the reason why our national motto from the beginning was E pluribus unum, out of many one. But we have convinced ourselves that the English story is the predominant one. And you all down in Texas may do more with DeSoto and some of the other sites. El Paso, Santa Fe, of course, is 1608, I believe, 1608, 1609. You may be doing more with that. But the larger point is our national narrative does not embrace this in the same way. The colonials knew it. They are interacting with, forming alliances with, having conflicts with. This is a convergence of cultures from the beginning that is the genesis of our nation. And yet we have allowed the narrative. The narrative has expanded to the point where any idea, any conversation about correcting it by putting these diverse voices and actions and individuals back into our story is viewed somehow as completely disruptive. That we are, revising history, that we are revisionists and we are anti-American and we are all of those things if we're doing this. And the fact is, you all know better. You know better. How many flags did Texas fly under? Right? And that's not new. How many people, as things shifted and changed. I mean, this is why, if we really want to have engaging conversations with our communities, if we really want our institutions to be reflective of the stories of us, then we got to put in the work. And it will be messy and it will be painful, but you can do it. You know how I know? And this is going to be my last bit of advice before we go to Q&A. I know this because I worked at one of the toughest places around the issues of diversity. As many of you heard in the introduction, I was the CEO of the American Civil War Museum in Richmond, Virginia, the former capital of the Confederacy. And I came to a small institution where, other than the janitorial staff when I got there, and there was one other Black woman on staff who was a visitor services associate, which meant for us at that time, that meant she gave tours, sold tickets. They were jack of all trades. Just me and her. When I left, our staff diversity was at 40%, and our staff reflected every possible mix. And it wasn't, oh, I got to have 6 more Black people. That wasn't the plan. The plan was to create an environment where all of us were involved and people were excited to come and work for us. And that first meant that we had to really rethink. We had to really embrace what our mission said for that organization. And then go out into the community and hear what the community had to say about their feelings. Because when I got there, I will tell you, I had donors telling me, we are sick to death of the Civil War. I said, I can guarantee you, you're probably more sick to death of the preponderance of the Confederate narrative, the lost cause. But the Civil War, you probably don't know. And we developed programs that tied that past to the lived experience of people in Richmond. And yes, we tackled the issues of monuments and the history. We had all of the documentations, excuse me, the records. We had a lot of the records and letters. We had an extraordinary, especially after we merged, we had extraordinary first-person accounts of the war itself, the aftermath, the Reconstruction period. We had this information at our disposal, and yet we did not turn into usable product for our community. And we decided that we needed to do that because they needed it. And as a result, not only were we attracting more people, I had staff members with blue hair and tattoos. And when I say blue hair, I mean like peacock blue mohawks working my front desk with gauges in their ears. I did limit the size of the gauge. I said, guys, don't make your gauges more than, than a quarter inch. But these were people who were passionate about history, Latino, LGBTQ, non-gender conformers. That was one of the biggest fights I had with one of my colleagues who was distressed that we had a person on our staff who was non-binary. And some days they showed up as he, and some days he showed up at work as she. And whatever gender they presented as, they were an outstanding employee. But this made people uncomfortable. But he was comfortable enough to come to work because of all the other people that he interacted with on a day-to-day basis. Now, the point is, we created an environment from the inside out, and we were proving ourselves daily because all of this was happening within the community. Those specific strategies, going through and really looking at those job descriptions and saying, these are the kind of people that you want. Are you one of these people? Not, I need somebody that's got a degree and so and so and so and so and so and must have experience, especially for entry-level positions. Why would you do that? Because 90% of, I can guarantee you, 90% of what you're going to be teaching that person, they're going to learn on your job. So why are you, calling yourself separating the wheat from the chaff? And again, it's because we've always done it that way. We don't think about how generations of exclusion are built into these practices. And if we don't address that, there will be no justice on our streets, and there will be no justice in our workplaces. And there certainly won't be equity, and there certainly won't be diversity, and it won't be an inclusive environment, except to the individuals that you have already chosen to be in, right? So as you're thinking about this work in your own locations, as you're thinking about this in a larger context, I am telling you now, there is no magic bullet. I am telling you now, you will mess up, because guess what? Part of this is also about dealing with your own stuff. To really create the kind of environment that I'm talking about, we all have to deal with where our own biases lie. We have to be able to dig deep into that and to have really honest conversations with ourselves and our teams about what may be holding us back. What are we afraid of? Because I can guarantee you, we will hear those. If we don't, we will continue to hear that really coded, loaded word, I just can't find qualified people. Have you stopped for a minute and asked the people that you kind of think you want what would make a job more attractive? Have you asked people why they haven't applied? Have you actually gone out into the communities that you may not have comfort with? I'm not talking about going to the usual suspects, because we all have those particular Black people or those particular Latinos in the community that have some standing, and we always go to those same people. But they aren't always going to be the ones who are using us using our products or our services on a day-to-day basis. Have we even had the conversations with high schools? Did you know that careers in museums are possible? No, what could that look like? Are you seeding it? Again, there are lots of ways that we can approach this work, but I have found greater success in this process, and it is a process. I have found greater success in the process when the commitment to do this work, the commitment to go through the pain together and the successes together is shared at every single level of the organization, and that it's being checked constantly, and that those things that are disruptive to that inclusive environment, and I'm not talking about, again, having everybody have to agree all the time, but that everyone feels valued in that space regardless of the work that they're doing. Those are the kinds of things that we should aspire to. And it's one of the things that I have seen bring about some pretty quick change just in the short 15 months I've been at Jamestown. Because when we started having these strategic conversations, I didn't start with my management team, and I did not start with my board. I started with frontline staff. In fact, I barred directors and supervisors from those initial meetings so that frontline personnel, including housekeeping, including facilities, including landscaping, people who had never been asked, but who have their ears when they are working, they are hearing what visitors are saying. They themselves represent a demographic that more often than not are not visiting museums. And they were able to tell us why. They were able to tell me why. And then we have been able together to create the 3 primary pillars that we're going to build this work on. And that work has begun. And I am really pleased with the results thus far. And we have wiped clean our HR department and are going through job description by job description to make sure that we clean those things up. So these are just some of the strategies. You will discover many of your own. But again, you got to put in the work if you want it to work. And on that, I will end these comments, and we'll spend the next 17 minutes or so with any questions that you all may have of me. And I just want to thank you all so much for your time and attention. And I'm sorry about that little blip. I don't know what happened to us during that time, but Johanna is going to filter through the questions. Hi, Johanna, how are you?
Hey there. Thank you for that amazing lecture, talk, just advice. So our first question is, do you know of a good resource out there for recognizing gatekeeping language in position postings?
Very good question. I would say there is one person that I have had the most conversation about this with, and her name is Nari Viner. She is a recruiter, because I had a detailed conversation with her about the language that's in executive director and CEO searches. And I told her, I said, Nari, you and I both know. She said, I know, it's killing me. I can't get these boards to stop doing this. I said, yeah, little things like, I said, you're really, what skills or what talents are you looking for versus the kinds of specifics that sometimes these jobs say? So a lot of CEO searches will say must have experience with 25 million or more capital campaigns. Well, that's going to knock out a whole bunch of women, and absolutely. But if you talk about somebody that has experience growing a development department, or if the board is able to bring in the kind of support, those kinds of things are the types of details that I'm talking about. So Nari is the person. Nari is with Koya Partners. I also know that Colleen Dellenschneider has been doing some work on this as well. But yeah, I mean, this right now, it's still catch as catch can. But there's also another company called Diversified Search, which I think has been doing a really good job with this. Thank you for the question.
Our next question is, I'm also recreating some comments here, but
sure.
Wow, that is mind blowing. We're wanting more of our student employees to have Indigenous backgrounds. So you posting jobs that are that direct, i.e. looking for students who identify as Indigenous, we're a state institution. Can we do that?
Yeah, we're a state institution as well. And so we can't hire specifically, because we're a state institution, we can't hire specifically to say that. But we are, everybody has that language, right? That EEOC language, which kind of makes me crazy. But guess what? You don't have to write it the way the law says it, right? You can actually take that language and saying, we're looking for dynamic people of color and indigenous communities to help add, and we don't discriminate against, and we're looking for, right? In every job description that you have, you can do that, right? And so for us, we aren't hiring just indigenous people to work in Paspahegh Town, just like we aren't just hiring white Englishmen to work on the ships, or men, period. I mean, there are women who work on our ships, right? So it's the idea, if you can make those kind of modifications, that can be really helpful. And each state certainly is going to be different, but I found, because JYF is a state agency with a private 501c3 that does all of our fundraising and all that kind of stuff that we do, they're connected pieces. I have not found any challenge with that. And I gotta say, my new director for HR has a whole bunch of other techniques that, when we were talking, he just blew me out of the water. Excuse me. I thought, are you kidding me? He said, oh yeah, people will say all the time, oh, we're going to go to the HBCU, thing. Everybody's going to the HBCU. Those kids coming out of HBCUs got all kinds of job opportunities. But you're not going to the high school where these kids, some of them are graduating and may not have college as their option, but they're bright. They just don't know what they're going to end up doing. Oh, and then the other thing, of course, is you got to deal with the pay issue. We all have to deal with the pay issue some kind of way, right? That was another big initiative that I've been pushing here, and we finally got our state, was fortunate in our case because, I am a state agency, that I was able to leverage our board and our relationships with our governor and legislators to say, I don't want to have to compete with Walmart and Target, who are paying people locally $13 to $15 an hour. People are going to go work there. They are not good. I see great customer service people who would be great on my front desk or great with visitor interaction. And I can't compete because our starting pay is $10.48 an hour. We have to do better. And we have to position our value. And we have to rethink what our pay structures are. And we have to demand that with our donors and, in fact, with other types of funders and state agencies to make this a viable economic thing. It is ridiculous. It is ridiculous. When I think about my first professional job with benefits and everything was back in 1989, and I was paid $23,500 a year, and that was considered a really good salary. And I have people starting now who don't make that. We're making 21. And so that general inequity, the way our economy has tilted, is really horrid. If minimum wage had kept up with not only the change in the GDP and inflation and everything else, we would be paying a minimum wage of about $22 an hour. But, rather than 62 times more than the median income for CEOs, they're now making over 300 something times the median income of their companies. That's where the money went. But I digress. Next question.
Right. The salary thing it's pretty wild, and
right.
Job descriptions, that would be really helpful.
Oh yeah, that's the other thing. Make sure you post whatever it is. Don't make people waste their time with you if they can't afford to work for you. Oh, and that's the other thing. Maybe there's some other benefit that you could offer, because a young person coming in may not necessarily need that. And I don't know. I mean, you can maybe work this out with your legislature. But a young person coming in who may want to work for you but can't because they're paying off student loans. We've basically bankrupted the Gen Zs and the millennials with this ridiculous student loan issue. That if there was a way to help them decrease that, either by, great direct pay would be great, but, versus putting aside for retirement if you're helping them reduce their rates. I don't know if that would work. Haven't tried that one yet on my people here. Whether or not the state of Virginia would allow me to under this governorship, we might have a shot, but I'm not sure whether that would carry forward. But again, the point is that think about other ways of compensation as well as you're pushing for more equitable compensation as attraction features. Yes.
Thank you for that. Next question is, what advice can you share as a museum director seeking to get to know her new Latinx community in a Texas border city as a minority white woman from the Northeast Midwest?
How would I recommend that you get to meet them? You have to go where they are. You can certainly do what everybody else does, and that is send out an invitation and say, oh, please join us for a special conversation about, if you haven't been willing to go to their house, what makes you think that they're going to come to yours? Get out into your communities. Go where the people are and introduce yourself the same way that you go to these galas and special fundraisers and all of those things. You go to the things that are important to that community you're trying to get to.
Yes. Our next question is, can you speak a bit to the challenges of balancing conversations between passionate staff who would love quick change and those staff with more tenure who might lean to a more cautious approach that can sometimes freeze dialogue and internal growth?
I can certainly appreciate that one because, I experience it and I have to manage it. And, at the end of the day, for me, it is the end game. Where are we really trying to go? And it's finding a course that's going to move things forward the way you need them to. Because, the truth of the matter is, especially if a person has been tenured or been at an institution for a long time, I can guarantee you they also have power. And they know where the bodies are, and they know how to stir stuff up. And they know how to, what's the word I'm looking for? They know how to subvert. Passive aggressive, whatever that is. They know how to do it, right? And so you have to be mindful to make sure that the progress is the types of things that you're trying to progressively move forward are going to be there. And yes, people will absolutely threaten to quit. I had somebody been here 25 years, knew the place inside out. So you're level up, that just doesn't make sense to me. And I'm just, and I was like, then I guess we're not going to agree. And you've got some options. Because guess what? But I'm in that seat. I can do that. And believe me, it took me quite a bit of listening before I realized what was really happening. It wasn't, they just didn't want to do it. They just didn't. They had built for themselves over 25 years a particular way of doing things, and they were not going to do anything that was radically different. They just weren't. And you have to, as a leader, in my view, that is why you lead. You have to help them see the benefit to them for the types of change that you're trying to institute and what it could in fact look like. And if they don't want to get with that, I mean, I just don't understand people who do not. Okay, so I mean, I just say it. I don't understand people who tolerate insubordination at that level, because that's what it is. It's insubordinate. We as an institution are going in this direction. You are deliberately blocking that. You need to go. And even as a state institution, I recognize that there are all kinds of additional things. Here at the state of Virginia, if I terminate a person who's been here for 25 years or a full-time vested employee, I am having to pay benefits and unemployment and all that kind of stuff on that staff member, their salaries in some cases. I have to pay all that stuff for the next year. Guess what? It's worth it to me to have that kind of toxicity out of my institution. It's worth it because I'm only going to feel that pain for a year. And the message will be sent loud and clear to everybody else that this is where we're going. And we'd really like you to come along. And we're going to make sure that you have all the resources you need to be successful. And even if you fail in your attempts, we still got you. We're going to help you take the next step and come out of that misstep because we're all going to make them. So, like I said, as a leader, I just have never understood why we tolerate that kind of disruption. Subsequently, I'm also not going to have a young person yelling in my face talking about, well, we need to do, demanding that we do this and demanding that. I'm not going to have that either. But I will hear them, I will listen, and then I will try to steer them to understand what would be a valuable step-by-step change, because sometimes you do have to do things step-by-step. And if they don't understand it, I will help them understand it rather than being so like, and again, both sides of this game here is to help them both understand why we have to take a certain approach, or, well, let's experiment with that and see what happens. And then deal with the consequences, learn from those consequences, right? I mean, too many of our institutions are afraid of risk. We have become so risk averse, and part of that is because we rely on public dollars. And when we rely on public dollars, we are afraid of what that impact will be. In some states and some state legislatures, especially if you're affiliated with government in any way, they can be downright spiteful. Well, we're just going to pull your funding if you're going to do that. But guess what? Generally speaking, political wins do. But if you do your homework on the front end and get to those legislators first about why it makes good sense to do the stuff that you do, because I talk to legislators all the time to make sure that they understand what I'm trying to do here. So when that odd man out, that decides that they want to put forth a bill to cut our funding or one of my colleagues' fundings at other state institutions, it doesn't fly. That's the beauty. We've been able to, as a group over these years, to keep a fairly level bipartisan support for the cultural sector. If you aren't doing that in Texas, shame on you. Do you know the power on your boards? And you all aren't using them to affect the kind of change that you need? Are you kidding me right now? Hell, I got 2 board members here at Jamestown who are from Houston. I went and got them. So you might want to do the same with your folk. We got 1 minute left, and I'll try to make this next answer shorter.
This is really important for me personally. Any advice for emerging Black, Indigenous, people of color professionals entering the field?
Any advice? Find yourself a mentor or someone whose career you respect. See what they've done. Reach out to them. You will be surprised. There aren't that many of us. As a Black woman, I will tell you there are less than 100 Black women running the 35,000 plus museums in the United States. 4% of our leadership are people of color, and by leadership, that is not only the CEO director level, but the departmental director level. Only 4%. But out of a field that has 62% a field that's 62% female. Our leadership in this field is 85% white male. So there aren't that many of us, sweetie, but we are accessible. This is one of the most accessible group of women I have ever had the pleasure of working with. And so, and sometimes it's just a matter of, tracking somebody down at a conference, picking up a phone. Most of us are accessible via email as well. We can help you, but just watch the trajectory of their career paths and then try to figure out what you want for yourself. There are people there to help you navigate that, because there's more than one path. There's more than one path.
Thank you.
Well, again, thank you all so much for your time and attention. I hope that this session has given you what you hope to hear and what you hope to learn. And I gave you some things to think about moving forward. It is indeed my pleasure. Thank you so much, TAM.
And thank you, Christy, for joining us today. Great advice, great perspectives. My sticky notes were busy that I'm going to add to the whiteboard later. For next to this programming update, we're going to be moving into our first of our TAM talks. Those are more conversational based talks. This one is going to be all around DEI issues. So stick with us. We're going to be leaving this and moving into that room. And then we'll have a concurrent sessions immediately after. Thanks again, Christy.
Thank you.